He was publicly humiliated, arrested in front of a cheering crowd, all because of a bright red MAGA hat he wore with quiet confidence. The FBI agent, certain of his authority, snatched the hat, stomped on it, and basked in the crowd's approval. But the troublemaker wasn't just any man. He was their new boss. What happened next would leave everyone in the room questioning their actions. The downtown square was chaos incarnate. Signs waved like restless flags in a storm, emblazoned with phrases that seemed to yell even louder than the protesters holding them. Equality for all, no more hate, and the pointedly accusatory, silence is complicity. Chanting voices reverberated off the glossy facades of nearby skyscrapers, their synchronized shouts giving the air a crackling charge, like the moments before a lightning strike. Makeshift stages had sprung up along the square's edges, where activists armed with megaphones punctuated their fiery speeches with raised fists. Tensions were high, and it showed. Here and there, shoving matches flared up like brush fires before being quickly smothered by bystanders. In the middle of it all, as though dropped into a scene where he didn't belong, stood Dan Rivers. He wasn't blending into the crowd. He was a stark contrast to it. At 45, his features were sharp, his clean-shaven jawline and graying temples lending him an air of quiet confidence. He was dressed deliberately but simply. Dark jeans, a crisp white button-up shirt rolled neatly at the sleeves, and perched boldly atop his head, the unmistakable symbol of political controversy. A bright red MAGA hat. The hat wasn't subtle. It wasn't tucked under an arm or angled modestly downward. It sat there, proud and unyielding, practically challenging the crowd to notice it. And notice they did. The square buzzed with a palpable shift in attention, as eyes locked onto the crimson beacon. Whispers turned into muttered insults, and mutters turned into outright hostility. "Get lost, racist!" a middle-aged woman spat as she walked by, her face twisted in disgust. She shot him one last venomous glare, before disappearing into the crowd. A wiry young man with dreadlocks and a Resist t-shirt followed suit, stopping just long enough to sneer. "You don't belong here, man." Dan, however, remained unmoved. His hands rested lightly in his pockets, and his gaze wandered the square with the detached precision of someone observing pieces on a chessboard. He didn't engage, didn't flinch. His lack of reaction seemed to provoke the crowd even more. The tension around him grew thicker, but he didn't budge. And then, like a predator spotting its prey, Tom Bradley entered the scene. At 30, Tom was fresh out of Quantico, his badge still gleaming with that new FBI agent polish. His black suit was immaculate, his sunglasses perched just a little too smugly on his nose, and the earpiece he wore gave him an aura of authority he was all too eager to wield. He wasn't just there to enforce order, he was there to prove himself. And in Dan Rivers, he saw his perfect opportunity. Pushing through the crowd with a purposeful stride, Tom stopped a few feet from Dan, his hand hovering near the radio clipped to his belt. His voice was sharp, loud enough to cut through the noise of the square. "Sir," he barked, "I need you to remove that hat. It's inciting the crowd." Dan turned slowly, deliberately, meeting Tom's gaze without a hint of fear. He raised one eyebrow in a calm, measured gesture. "Since when?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Is wearing a hat illegal?" Tom stiffened at the unexpected pushback. His jaw clenched, and for a moment his composure faltered. He had expected compliance, not defiance. Frustration flickered across his face, but he quickly recovered, unwilling to lose control of the situation. Without warning, he reached out and snatched the hat off Dan's head in one swift motion. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed immediately by cheers. Tom, emboldened by the reaction, held the hat aloft like a trophy. But he wasn't done. With a dramatic flourish, he threw the hat to the ground and raised his polished black shoe, grinding it into the pavement. The cheers grew louder, a triumphant chorus from those who felt vindicated by the act. Dan remained rooted in place. His posture didn't shift, his hands stayed in his pockets, and his face betrayed no emotion. But his sharp blue eyes narrowed, locking onto Tom with an intensity that could chill the air. There was no anger in his gaze, just a quiet, unnerving calculation, as though he were filing the moment away for later use. Tom allowed himself a smirk, soaking in the crowd's approval. In his mind, he had handled the situation perfectly, putting another troublemaker in his place. But to Dan, this was far from over. With the crowd feeding off the raw adrenaline of the confrontation, Tom saw an opportunity to elevate his moment. The cheers that had erupted after he stomped on the MAGA hat gave him a surge of confidence. He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest as he raised his voice above the din. This wasn't just crowd control anymore. It was theater. "Men like you," he declared, jabbing an accusatory finger toward Dan, "are the problem with this country." His words cut through the noise like a blade, drawing the attention of onlookers. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, quieting slightly as people turned to see what would happen next. "You think wearing a hat like that makes you some kind of hero?" Tom continued, his tone growing sharper. "You think it gives you the right to disrupt society? It's disgusting." His voice dripped with contempt, each word calculated to strike a nerve. But Dan didn't react. His face was a picture of neutrality, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, shoulders relaxed. The man who had sparked so much fury stood there, unmoving, as though the entire scene was beneath him. His silence wasn't submission. It was unnervingly deliberate. It was as if he knew something no one else did. Tom's smirk faltered momentarily. The lack of response was maddening, but the murmurs of agreement from the crowd reignited his resolve. He took a step closer, his voice dropping into a threatening growl. "You're going to leave this area," Tom demanded, pointing toward the edge of the square. "Or I'll make sure you regret it." Dan tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze sharpening like the edge of a blade. His movements were slow and deliberate as he reached into his pocket, drawing the attention of both the crowd and the agent. Without a word, he pulled out a sleek smartphone, tapped the screen, and raised it steadily, the camera lens locking onto Tom. The small red dot in the corner of the screen blinked to life. "Say that again, Agent," Dan said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. "For the record." Tom froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he realized what was happening. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant. For the first time, he felt the weight of the crowd's gaze on him, not as a hero, but as a spectacle. His jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. The tension thickened. But Tom's frustration boiled over into anger. The idea of being recorded, of his actions being scrutinized, only fueled his determination to regain control. "Enough of this," Tom barked, snapping his radio off his belt. "Backup requested at my location. We've got a disruptive individual refusing to comply." It didn't take long. Within minutes, the situation escalated. A squad of uniformed officers pushed through the crowd, their stoic expressions contrasting with the chaotic energy around them. The crowd stirred, sensing the drama heightening, their phones raised high to capture every second. The officers formed a loose circle around Dan, their presence adding weight to Tom's authority. One of them stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Dan didn't move at first. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Tom's, searching him, reading him. After a beat of silence, he complied without a word, turning slowly and offering his wrists. The cold click of the cuffs echoed louder than the crowd's murmurs. Dan's movements remained deliberate, his calm demeanor unshaken, as the officers gripped his arms and began leading him away. The crowd erupted again, a mix of cheers and taunts. "Good riddance!" a woman yelled, waving her protest sign high in triumph. Others clapped and hollered, their voices rising into a chaotic symphony as Dan was marched through the crowd like a criminal on display. Despite the noise, Dan's face didn't change. He held his head high, his expression unreadable. Tom stood tall, watching the scene with a sense of triumph. In his mind, he had done what needed to be done. The disruptive man had been put in his place, and order had been restored. But the cameras told a different story. They had captured every word, every movement, every second of the interaction. What Tom didn't realize was that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of authority. It was the beginning of his unraveling. And most importantly, he had no idea who Dan Rivers truly was. The fallout was coming, and it would be far more explosive than he could have ever imagined. A few hours later, the sterile FBI conference room was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights casting their harsh, clinical glow across the metal table and stark white walls. Dan Rivers sat at the table, his wrists still bound in handcuffs that rested lightly in his lap. The restraint seemed almost laughable against his composed demeanor. Despite the circumstances, he exuded an air of authority, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. It was the same quiet composure that had driven Tom Bradley to the brink of fury earlier in the square. Outside the room, Tom paced the hallway, his polished shoes tapping sharply against the tile floor. His chest was puffed out, his movements erratic as he relived the moment of his perceived triumph. "Did you see the way he just stood there?" he bragged to a fellow agent, his tone dripping with arrogance. "These MAGA guys think they're untouchable. Well, not on my watch. I taught him a lesson he won't forget." The colleague nodded half-heartedly, his discomfort evident as he avoided meeting Tom's eyes. The overconfidence radiating off Tom was palpable, but no one dared to challenge him. As Tom continued pacing, the door to the conference room creaked open. The sound drew his attention, and he paused mid-stride. The head of the field office entered the room, a tall man in his early 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. His neatly combed silver hair and immaculate suit added to his commanding presence. His expression was grave as his gaze swept the room and landed on Dan. "Rivers?" he asked, his voice formal, almost reverent. Dan stood slowly, the metallic clink of the cuffs punctuating the silence. His calm, unreadable expression didn't falter, but there was a subtle glint of satisfaction in his eyes as he replied, "That's me." Tom, watching through the narrow glass window on the door, froze in place, confusion flickering across his face. The head of the office extended his hand to Dan. "Welcome aboard, sir," he said, his tone respectful. Tom's stomach dropped. "Sir!" The word hit him like a freight train. Panic bubbled in his chest as he craned his neck, trying to see more of the interaction. Dan, still in cuffs, shook the hand firmly, his professionalism unshaken. The head of the office turned sharply toward the officer stationed outside. "Why is Director Rivers in handcuffs?" he demanded, his voice steely and clipped. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale. One finally muttered, "Agent Bradley's orders, sir." The head's jaw tightened, his glare enough to make the officer squirm. "Get them off! Now!" The officer scrambled to obey, fumbling with the keys before unlocking the cuffs and freeing Dan's wrists. Dan flexed his fingers briefly, rubbing his wrists with a small, almost imperceptible smirk, tugging at the corner of his mouth. He glanced at Tom, who was still frozen outside the room, looking like a deer caught in headlights. Dan stepped out of the room with a confident stride, walking past Tom without a word at first. In the hallway, senior staff members greeted him warmly, offering handshakes and murmured welcomes. "Welcome, Director Rivers," one said with a smile. Tom's jaw dropped. His brain scrambled to process the scene unfolding before him. Director? The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. Dan Rivers wasn't just some protester or a random guy in a MAGA hat. He was the newly appointed regional director of the FBI, and his authority dwarfed Tom's in every conceivable way. Dan stopped mid-stride and turned, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Tom. The smirk that had been playing on his lips was gone, replaced by a cold, commanding presence. "Agent Bradley," Dan said, his voice low, but sharp enough to cut steel. "I'll be reviewing your conduct personally. Expect a meeting on my desk first thing tomorrow." Tom's throat went dry. He swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Dan's words. All the confidence he'd flaunted earlier vanished, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Dan lingered for a moment, his gaze steady and unyielding, before turning on his heel and continuing down the hall. Staff members parted like the Red Sea, falling into step behind him like soldiers following their general. Tom stood rooted in place, the realization of his catastrophic mistake crashing over him like a tidal wave. The man he'd humiliated in front of a crowd wasn't just anyone. He was his boss, and he was about to face consequences he hadn't seen coming. The next morning, Tension hung thick in the air of the FBI field office. The normally bustling corridors were subdued, as if everyone was holding their breath. A mandatory meeting had been called, and speculation ran rampant. Agents murmured in hushed tones as they made their way to the main briefing room, glancing nervously at each other. The buzz was undeniable. The new director was about to make his first official address. Inside the briefing room, the atmosphere was electric. Chairs filled quickly, and the noise of shuffling papers and whispered conversations gradually died down as Dan Rivers stepped to the podium. He was the picture of authority. His tailored navy blue suit was immaculate, every detail carefully considered. But what truly commanded attention was the bright red MAGA hat, perched prominently atop his head. It was spotless, gleaming even, as though it had been polished specifically for the occasion. The boldness of it was impossible to ignore, and it sent a silent, unmissable message. As Dan scanned the room, the agents fell silent. His calm yet commanding presence demanded respect. He began to speak, his voice steady and deliberate, cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a knife. "Professionalism and impartiality," he said, his tone measured but firm, "are non-negotiable. They are the foundation of our work and the trust the American people place in us. If we allow personal biases to cloud our judgment, we fail, not just ourselves, but the very Constitution we are sworn to uphold." Heads nodded across the room, a collective acknowledgement of the truth in his words. Some agents sat straighter in their chairs, clearly inspired by the gravity of his statement. Others exchanged quiet glances, sensing that this meeting was about more than general platitudes. At the back of the room, however, one figure was anything but composed. Tom Bradley stood stiffly against the wall, his face pale, his eyes glued to the floor. His usual swagger was nowhere to be seen. He shifted uncomfortably, a bead of sweat forming on his temple as he avoided looking up at all costs. Dan's piercing gaze swept across the room before locking squarely on Tom. His expression hardened, his voice taking on an edge that silenced even the faintest whispers. "And Agent Bradley," Dan began, his deliberate pause drawing every eye in the room toward the agent in question. Tom's heart sank as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Dan continued, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Your actions yesterday were unacceptable, and a clear violation of the standards we hold ourselves to in this agency." The room collectively froze. The silence was deafening as every agent turned to stare at Tom, their expressions ranging from shock to quiet judgment. Tom's breath hitched, and his pulse pounded in his ears. He felt exposed, as though every flaw, every mistake he'd ever made was on display for the world to see. "You are suspended, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation," Dan announced, his voice steady, unrelenting. "I suggest you use this time to reflect on what it means to uphold the Constitution, not just in words, but in action." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, agents exchanging wide-eyed looks. The weight of the declaration hung in the air. Tom's face turned crimson, humiliation washing over him like a tidal wave. He felt every pair of eyes boring into him, judgment radiating from his colleagues. Dan, unfazed by the reaction, reached up and adjusted his MAGA hat with a practiced motion. A small, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, and Bradley," he added, his voice lighter now, but still razor-sharp. "Thanks for cleaning my hat. It looks good as new." The remark landed like a hammer. A few quiet chuckles broke the tension, rippling through the room as agents exchanged knowing looks. For Tom, it was the final blow. He wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. The meeting concluded with a wave of applause, some for Dan's strong leadership, others for the poetic justice of the situation. Tom lingered in the back as agents began filing out, frozen in place as the reality of his public disgrace set in. When he finally moved, it was a slow, defeated shuffle. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped. Each step felt heavier than the last as he made his way toward the exit, the judgmental eyes of his colleagues following him like a spotlight. Dan watched him leave, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. The message was clear to everyone in the room. Professionalism had been restored, justice had been served, and respect for the office would be upheld. And the hat? It remained a symbol of conviction, resilience, and above all triumph.